Welcome to our Rooted webinar entitled Caring for Teenagers in an Epidemic of Loneliness. I'm Skyler Flowers. I'm a member of Rooted Steering Committee, and I'm assistant pastor to students, which covers college students, youth in high school, middle school, all the way down to children at Grace Bible Church in Oxford, Mississippi. Thank you guys so much for joining us on this important topic of loneliness. Rooted's mission is to equip and empower churches and parents to faithfully disciple students towards lifelong faith in Jesus Christ. We encourage youth ministers to approach this goal from what we call the 5 pillars of youth ministry. Those 5 pillars are gospel centrality, theological depth through expository Bible teaching, relational discipleship, partnering with parents, and intergenerational integration. Today, I think we're focusing really on all of them will come into play in how we talk about loneliness in teaching, how we deal with loneliness in personal relationships, how we integrate the church into this, but especially when we think about relational discipleship and intergenerational integration. So we're going to consider how we can come alongside students in hurt and isolation that so many of them experience. And I'm glad to be joined today by my friends, Anna Harris and Kendal Connor. Anna is a single mom of 3 grown sons. We previously had it almost grown until she came to the realization. Sadly for her, I'm getting a call. Go ahead and throw this thing on Do Not Disturb.
There you go.
But either way, her sons can no longer quite be classified. It's happening again. Okay, I'm on Do Not Disturb, so I don't know why it's doing that. All right. She is the Rooted blog editor-in-chief and co-host of the Rooted Parent podcast. And then Kendal Connor. Kendal currently serves as the groups minister at Redeemer Fellowship in Kansas City, Missouri. She's originally from Memphis, Tennessee. Kendal received her BA from Union University, and she has previously served in youth ministry for 10 years, beginning overseas and then serving teenagers stateside. So I'm glad to be joined by you guys. To open up our time, I wanted to read this quick quote coming from this New York Times article that really frames kind of what we're talking about and why we would describe this as an epidemic. The article says that a year before the COVID-19 pandemic began, a Canadian college student sent one of their teachers an email that illustrates how smartphones have changed social dynamics in schools. This is what the email said. Gen Z are an incredibly isolated group of people, he wrote. We have shallow friendships and superfluous romantic relationships that are mediated and governed to a large degree by social media. He then reflected on the difficulty of talking to his peers. There is hardly a sense of community on campus, and it's not hard to see why. Often, I'll arrive early to a lecture, find a room of 30 plus students sitting together in complete silence, absorbed in their smartphones, afraid to speak and be heard by their peers. This leads to further isolation and a weakening of self-identity and confidence, something I know because I've experienced it. This is an experience that we're seeing in students, both driven by smartphones, both not, in relationships and friendships and parenting. And that is why so many studies continue to show us how prevalent and how growing this generation is in terms of loneliness. And so I want to dive in and I want to ask Anna and Kendal, what have you observed in regard to young people and loneliness that's different from before the pandemic? So what is it about the COVID-19 pandemic that has really seemed to drive this issue even deeper?
Yeah, wow. I think it's unquestionable that this is true in the experience of my kids and of their friends and my friends' kids. I think kids were increasingly lonely before the pandemic. I think that there are a lot of factors that went into that, social media being one of the primary ones, but I feel like post-pandemic that they're struggling with more hopelessness, more a sense of things may not get a whole lot better. And I think that they have lost some security. The adults that they look to sort of provide parameters for their lives, boy, during the pandemic, it really looked like adults didn't know what they were doing, right? I mean, first we're saying this, then we're saying this, and different adults in different parts of the country are saying different things. And so I think all of that is lost to this, they've lost a sense of security and lost a sense of that good stuff is ahead, and they have a lot to look forward to. And I think a lot of them are stuck a little bit in hiding since the pandemic.
Yeah, I would say the same. I think, and I'll probably talk a little bit more about this later because it's been really helpful for me in processing caring for students right now. But I think what the pandemic has done more than anything else is the loneliness epidemic was already occurring before the pandemic. What the pandemic has done is created these plausibility structures to like continue to isolate the students, right? So now where isolation was already occurring, now there's actually like plausibility that this is something that could be maintained potentially, that you realize you could do things in isolation and still be okay, that maybe you don't have to go to school, maybe you don't have to go to youth group, maybe you don't have to go to church. And that has over geared kind of the idea of isolation. And then also you see what Anna mentioned of who our students are imitating as their parents. And I think that you've seen more fear in parents in regards to community, just in people in general, right? Because of the pandemic. So now not only is there isolation due to like social media and technology, but there's isolation due to fear, which I don't think was fully there before the pandemic.
Yeah, I was thinking, when you look at studies that cover the previous generation, not the ones that are currently students, but those who are finishing college now, who are kind of in between, I'm done with college and the age of 30, 32, studies show that they were largely shaped by two major world events. And those two major world events were 9/11 and the financial crisis of 2008. And so because of that, there's certain patterns that you can see in that generation, like a certain fear of the world, but also a certain fear about money and the desire to completely hoard money, to view money as something that you have to grip tightly to. But because two of the major shaping events when they were young were events that taught them the world is a lot larger and maybe more frightening than I previously thought when I was a child. And then also that, okay, maybe if we have finances now and we're doing okay now, that might not be true later. And so these early events shape the way they view it. Well, when we're looking at our students, and I was thinking just today, I was scrolling back on something and I was trying to think, okay, I want to get pre-pandemic, it's like this podcast and I was like, I want to get pre-pandemic whenever they were actually in the room together. And I had to scroll back so far and it actually was a reminder to me, we're really getting 2+ years away. Right now we're at 2 years from when the pandemic started. We're really starting to distance ourselves from those initial moments of fear and all the thought that there's just the craziness that was going on then. And to think of that means the kids that were doing that when they were 12 are now 14, or the kids that were 14 are now 16 and they're driving and they're starting to mature. And the kids that were 16 when they should have been just getting their freedom and getting out of the house are now 18 and they're about to go to college. And so some of the most formative times in their lives that would establish how they're going to live the life for the rest of their lives, 2 years of it was almost completely taken away and made them to stay home and to stay isolated and to feel isolated. And so all the ways that they would develop relationships normally had to completely morph and change. And so it's just something I don't think we've quite reckoned with and really begun to understand how formative the pandemic actually is in terms of developing students currently, and then and as parents that we have them in our house, of how much it changed for them after that.
Yeah.
And so I also want to ask, what is it about teenagers, kind of moving the question a little bit away from the pandemic, why are teenagers so vulnerable to this deep sense of isolation? What is it about the season of life itself that makes it so them so perceptive? To receive that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would definitely say it's even what you named, right? The reality of our middle schoolers, high schoolers, those even into college, those are formative years. They've always been described that way because those are years that form the way that we reason, not just the way that we think. And so I think like coming into that, you think of, hey, growing up, even into elementary school, kids will mimic whoever their role model or their like adult figure in their life is, right? So they will do the things that the adult does. They will learn to be excited about the things that their adult figure is excited about, or be afraid of the things that their adult figure is afraid of. And then coming into middle school, high school is when they start to form their own ability to reason, to have rationale, to pursue things on their own. And so the world in which they grow up in is very significant, because it does help to form not just their character, but their reasoning skills, like how they think about the world, how they think about the future. And so I think that in that time, in those formative years, they're more prone to this reality of isolation, because they're more attuned toward what is maybe things that they're longing for, they don't know how to get. They're more prone toward, especially in a world that we're in right now, of we long for community, we're built for that, we want that, they want that, but they don't have the ability to really think through what are other ways to get that, or why is it so significant if this is what I'm offered, this is all I have in front of me. And it's also the time where they're learning to form relationships that are really scary, because they're figuring out who they are. And it's been a teenager's like personality, even long before the loneliness epidemic, right? To isolate ourselves when we feel awkward, or when we're not sure of how we can process things. We kind of pull away from our peers when we feel embarrassed. So they're in that phase right now. And so they're more prone to pull away until they figure out what they need to do to push in. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think, when kids are younger, so many of the parameters that they have around them are set by adults. In elementary school, they're usually generally in one class, and they're with the same kids all day long. And then as they move to middle school, they start to change classes, and whereas they might spend the day with, 30 kids when they were in elementary, now all of a sudden they're spending the day with 130 kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so middle school, I think, is so painful, because they start to learn to belong, and they start to learn who are the kind of kids I want to be with? How do I want to present myself? All those things are happening. And then these kids got that got cut short. In high school, the boundaries get even wider. They go to school with even more kids, and they get driver's licenses in the middle of it. And then all of that got, their world not only didn't get bigger when it was supposed to, it got shrunk really, really small.
Mm-hmm.
And even the things of belonging that they would have with their families, like going to church and, interacting with other families that their family hangs out with, all that got, so they were in a really vulnerable time for this to happen.
Yeah. And to Kendall's point, I mean, it's always been seen that way, that teenage years is awkward and anxiety inducing. I was thinking of just like, you go back to like 70s and 80s, and it's like every other movie is about, teenage years. And it's not shown, it's like, oh, this is supposed to be the best years of your life, but it's also always kind of about being an outcast. If it's about a popular kid, well, the popular kid internally is like, no, but that's not really who I want to be. I want to be this other person. And then it's about the person that's a social outcast. It's about them being able to discover themselves. I mean, we've always kind of had this idea that this is formative, but it's also a deeply isolating time just in and of itself. Yeah. Because during this time is so much of when you're trying to figure out of who you want to be, and the world is telling you better figure out who you want to be. And so with the rise of technology, and this is really going back even, before the pandemic, one at the New York Times, two psychologists, they wrote, and they suggested that the rise in loneliness among teenagers probably has to do more with smartphones and technology than it even has to do with COVID. They wrote, many mental health problems will be attributed to the COVID pandemic. But in fact, we need to look back further to 2012. That's when rates of teenage depression, loneliness, self-harm, and suicide began to rise sharply. By 2019, just before the pandemic, rates of depression among adolescents had nearly doubled, end quote. I mean, going back to 2012 in my mind, I always tell parents now that in some ways, they're even better equipped now than we were in 2012 to deal with this, because in 2012, it was like the Wild West of just like, okay, well, here's a smartphone. We don't really know what you can do with it, but have fun. And then teenagers were the ones that were creating the culture and creating the patterns of everything. It wasn't shaped by their parents. It was shaped by whatever the heck they could figure out and do. And that's why it was just so crazy. And I was talking to a parent just the other day, and we were talking about video games and how high school guys, a ton of guys in our ministry, they play a lot of video games. But the parent was saying, but it's actually really great because they have these headsets now and they communicate, and so it's like they're playing video games, but they're actually doing it to where they're actually building relationships. But even still, in that regard, it's interesting because then everything is still mediated through technology, which, and Jen Pollock Michelle, I think we'll talk a little bit more about the article she wrote for Christianity Today later, but she had this point how all social media in this regard, it gives you the illusion of relationship in the sense that it says this, we're communicating, we're interacting, we're liking, we're commenting, but everything is still self-driven. You know, it's so focused through media that the reality of relationships, that they require effort. You know, okay, I got to sacrifice my time. I can't just have this relationship in my bedroom via headset. They require even suffering is seemingly being lost because of the mediation through technology. Yeah. And so I wanted to ask you guys, how are y'all seeing this in your ministries when you talk with parents? How are you guys seeing this, like how it's matching to what's we're starting to see statistically in studies of the isolation coming perhaps from more so from technology? How are you guys seeing this even on the ground?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say is like just the really practical reality of it is what we just named before. This has been this kind of tension that's within the teenage years has existed forever. But now when I was in high school, if I didn't get invited to a school dance, I would sit at home, be sad that I wasn't there, but I didn't have to watch all of my friends be present at it. So now your students have this dichotomized reality in front of them to where not only are they left out of things, but they're actually getting to like witness what they're left out of, which is a huge factor in building in that loneliness or that isolation. Because in your mind before, you could imagine others weren't there. Yeah. So you just build all these things into your mind. Right. So I think that's a huge part of it. But also in the middle of all that, I think, so I've been kind of thinking through and processing. I don't know if you've ever heard of, there's a British anthropologist, Robin Dunbar, who presented this, and it's called the Dunbar number. And it's this idea of, we all have this ability to relationally interact with up to his number is 150. That can shift depending on different personalities, but 150 people is what we can maximally like actually care for, interact with, have relationship with people. But obviously he presents it in these kind of concentric circles of your core inner is about 3 to 5 people, and relationally what that goes out. And then you can have your outward circle of recognition of faces, like acquaintances, I guess you would say, it would be like 500. So in thinking through this idea with our students, and one of the things that I'm noticing is I feel like our students are actually experiencing this reversal of relationship, at least the students that I'm interacting with, where what we would often give to that inner circle of 3 to 5, like our most vulnerable thoughts and emotions and feelings, things that we would reserve for those who are closest to us, are actually what our students are giving to their circle of 500 online. And normally when you interact with those relationships, right, like giving those deep feelings, like there's a reason why they're supposed to be your closest people, is that it's a two-way relationship. But online, that two-way relationship can't happen. And so I'm still like processing through all of it, but I feel like that's what I'm seeing is them giving their what is reserved for your closest relationships out to the people who actually can't give that back, which then makes you exhausted for the relationships that you do have. And that kind of creates that tension and that dichotomy of, I feel lonely because I am giving a ton, but I don't feel like I'm getting anything back, if that makes sense. I feel like that's a lot of what social media is doing.
Yeah. And you're even in that situation, you're mediating what you give out. So there's no one ever really pushing you to say, come on, is there really something deeper there? You're even getting to control the narrative of what, okay, well, because that's one thing I always think about, the authenticity, and I'm air quotes around that, of social media is we see people saying, I'm going to be real and I'm going to be vulnerable. And then when they post it, you're like, okay, I do think you're letting us in a little bit. but okay, but there's still something behind this that,
Not
that
that
only,
two-way, yeah.
only an embodied, two-way relationship could really pull out and could ask questions and stuff.
Yeah.
But Anna, I was wondering what you think and how you're seeing this.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating concept, that you're talking, the way we overshare and then it stunts our actual face-to-face sharing. That's really profound. I feel like, as a parent, what I long for my kids to remember is how to be actually with people face to face. And I think that that's the most helpful thing that I can do, is call them to spend time with actual people with their phones set aside. And, we can't have true relationship with people if we're never in the same room with them and we don't get their nonverbal communication and we don't know touch. And it's not that parents snuggle with their teenagers the way they did when they were 4, but there's still the pat on the back, the side hug, the kiss on the cheek, good night, all those things that can only happen with certain people. And I think that parents really need to lean in to the being present with your people in your home, because I think our kids are wounded. What you're talking about, putting themselves out on social media and getting feedback, be it positive or negative, it's stunted and wounded in terms of actual interaction. And so we have to be, when we're in person as their youth pastors or as their parents or neighbors or, aunts and uncle, whatever it is, we have to be that much more attuned and present when we're actually with our teenagers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about that just in the terms of, okay, how plugged in am I, in the sense of what example am I setting if I'm at church on Sunday and I'm looking at my phone while the pastor's preaching. Okay, if we're singing the music before youth group and I'm checking my email or something like that, what example am I setting for the students in my youth ministry, but also for my family? I'm thinking, okay, well, gosh, if at the dinner table it's like I'm going to eat quickly so that I can go watch TV, or eating in front of the TV all the time. What kind of even subtle, communication is that telling them about this is what relationship really is? It's just, we may be in the same room. Even when we are in the same room, we're still trying to get to the place of entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, Anna, some of the things you talked about there, that's also really interesting is like, as we're seeing this rise in loneliness, it also means that like youth pastors and parents almost need to be, I almost feel sometimes I'm like, gosh, every one of us needs to be professional licensed counselors. Because it's like because the conversations that need to be happening. I'm finding parents oftentimes, they're like, I want to talk to my kids about these things. I don't even know what questions to ask, or I can't get them to open up. Or as a youth pastor, it's like, gosh, okay, I want to talk to our students about this. I can see this student is isolating themselves.
Mm-hmm.
How do I enter into that? So I wanted to kind of ask first from the church perspective, what's the unique role that the church plays in offering lonely teenagers a place to belong? Like, what is the opportunity that churches have to be that place to begin this habit formation of relationship building and drawing at people out of loneliness?
Yeah, I think what's the role that we offer? Like, I think it's actually what the church is built to offer for any and all of Christ's disciples, right? Is that the church is meant to be the community. Like, we were not saved unto ourselves. We were actually saved unto the people of God. Like, God saved us to be a part of his family and to be a part of a community. And you can see studies secular all over the place that talk about how one of the ways to combat loneliness is through a sense of belonging to a community, belonging to a purpose bigger than yourself. And we could say that all day, which is true, right? Belonging to the church is a sense of ownership of something and belonging to a community. But I think the church's role more than anything else is to disciple its people. And part of discipleship is, how do we bear the image of God? The image of God is a relational triune God. And so how do we actually form our students in discipleship, which includes relational discipleship. So how do we put them into places where they're not just attending church, but they're actually having to be in places and spaces that create relational dynamics that we get to help disciple them into and get to help walk with them through. And like, there's so many different ways to do that, so many practicals I won't go into, but like, yeah, I think that that's our role is relational discipleship, to talk about what the difference between family and versus just friendship and what that offers in the church.
Yeah. I think one thing that can be helpful, or one thing that I would say that giving it a framework there, you really need three things in place, I think, to start to bring a lonely student into the care of the youth pastor, the group, the church. And I think the first is that the youth pastor really needs to know that the student is lonely. And that's on the parent or the friends of the family or other adults who know this child. And to let the youth pastor, let the church know, here's a child we need to go after. Secondly, I think that the youth pastor has to, and this is always my thing to youth pastors, don't give up, don't give up, don't give up. Pursue, and you're going to pursue different kids different ways. I totally get that. But even if you're just pursuing them in prayer, ask God, do not let up on that kid. But don't give up on the lonely kid. And the third, I think that can be effective, if you've got some youth group kids that are coming and are receptive, sometimes you can get those kids to reach out to the lonely one, because it's one thing to get a text from an adult saying, one of the Sunday school teachers in the youth, hey, I missed you. And that's sweet. And there's a place for that. It's a little step better to get a text from the youth pastor saying, hey, I missed you. But boy, how effective is it if we can get kids to reach out to kids and draw each other in? It's good for the lonely kid, and it's good for the kid who is in the group, because everybody's learning community. And so back to your point, Kendal, it's teaching kids one at a time that they're part of a community that loves them and will go after them and is not going to quit.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, Anna, that was a great point there at the end. I was thinking, we had a parent recently. She came to me and she was like, I was like, hey, we've missed your daughter. We hadn't seen her in a while, and she was just really honest. She was like, she likes coming, but the girls at her age, she just doesn't know them super well, and she'd love to hang out with them, but it doesn't make her feel super welcome. Well, and easily you just say, man, well, she needs to get out of, she needs to come out of her shell or something. But actually, the way to actually lead both that other group and this girl that's feeling the loneliness into, okay, the rhythms of relationship was, we had one of our leaders go talk to some of the girls that are in her grade and just say, hey, this girl's coming. She feels really isolated and alone, but she would love to. And, these girls were like, okay, so when she comes in, would you guys just go talk to her and just include her tonight? And it really does. It doesn't shame anyone, but it does teach both groups, okay, to look out for the other and to bring them in. Yes. Some of the other habit forming ways, I think, like I said, as I was mentioning at the beginning, how really so many of the pillars involve this. But I was having a conversation with a parent today that really was really helping me. And Anna, you hit on this of how to involve the parents here, of continually reaching out to the parents and having those conversations with the parents. So there's a direct dialogue back and forth between myself and the other youth leaders, the volunteers, and the parents of the students. So that I can't see this kid all the time. For me, there's times when I think a student, man, I was like, oh gosh, they're so outgoing and they don't feel isolated at all. And they're doing things. And then their parent comes through and they're like, oh no. At home, it's a completely different story. In fact, they're every night it's tears, and every night it's crying. And so being able to bring the parents into that and involving the parents in the conversations, are so crucial in how to do that. And we have a question here in the Q&A, and it's actually one we were going to kind of talk about anyway, but I just think we'll go ahead and jump to it. Is Anna, especially thinking of parenting, what do parents need from kids' youth pastors right now in terms of equipping, having those conversations? What are some of the ways youth pastors can be equipping and coming alongside parents as they minister to these students, when these parents are already trying their best and they've already got 1,000 other things to worry about and think about? How can youth pastors be coming alongside them effectively?
Yeah. Well, first I will say youth pastors have 1,000 things to think about too. I mean, it's not all on you, and y'all are just as busy, if not busier than we are. So we recognize that. I think anytime you can give us lines of communication, I know you get tired of sending emails that you think nobody reads, but some of us do read them. And I promise. And even just knowing that you reached out to me reminds me that you're there, even if I don't read the email. So that's just a little encouragement. If you have time, like during the day, the students are in school, grab coffee with a parent and get to know us as well. I think any programming that your church can do that equips the parents, just letting parents know that you're committed to them as parents, not just as Christ followers, which is really, really important, but as parents who are following Christ. Mm-hmm. And yeah, those are, and anything you can do to involve us in terms, I mean, we can bake cookies and we can drive carpools and I know that you have trouble getting volunteers. I know that that's a flip side too, but I think you might have to pursue us like you pursue the students. Sorry.
No, that's great. I always tell, whenever I meet someone who's new to youth, or they're taking on a new job in youth ministry, or this is their first time in youth ministry, one of the things I always tell them is, hey, the first thing you should do, it'll be a lot of work at the front end, but it'll go a long way, is get lunch or a coffee with every parent you can in the ministry and just ask them about their family and ask them about their student, because I can talk to the student, every Sunday or every Wednesday when they come in and really get a good sense of them. And then their parents can give me so much more depth and history of who they were when they were a child, who they were in middle school. But there was this major event when they lost this loved one. And that ever since then, they've kind of been on a different track. That meant just those little touch points along the way go a long way in having the history. There was a student once, she was in our ministry in Orlando, and she comes in the youth group. She just doesn't say a word, in and out for like a month. And I just think, oh, she's just, that's just who she is. She's just kind of quiet. Sometimes she talks. When we talk, we really engage her, she'll talk, but not really all that much. And I went and got lunch with her parents, and they were like, oh, no, she is super bubbly, huge personality, loves people. And I was like, well, where's the disconnect? What are we doing? Well, then they start to fill me in on some details. Okay, we moved. And then when we moved, she didn't want to move. Oh, and then we went to this one church. And then after a couple of months, we decided to move that church. And okay, well, now I'm starting to see a pattern here. If she doesn't want to be here because she's mad at her parents for this thing and the other. Okay, now she's at a new school. She loves her old school, all these other things. And I was like, okay, now some of these pieces are starting to fall into place. That really helped me to understand why she was so isolated, both at youth group, but also just at home and even in her school and everything. And so okay, now my conversations are tinted a little differently. Maybe so much of them, but they're tinted a little differently because I now have a different intentionality when I'm speaking with this person that I wouldn't have before. Yeah. Kendal, anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think too, there's a level to which, depending on the church that you're at, right, and depending on even the size of your church, I don't want to talk about that often, but the number of parents that you may have in your student ministry and the number of relationships that you may feel, again, it's the Dunbar's number of even ourselves, we have only a certain number of relationships that we can hold well. So I think even thinking of this, think of ways that you can take chunks of this at a time. So maybe it is the 6th grade. If that's the grade that comes into your student ministry, you commit to within the first year grabbing coffee or a phone call with each one of the 6th graders' parents. And then you slowly are building that over time. And then also at my last church, one of the things that we tried to do as well as we could was think of, okay, parents are busy, we're busy. How can we double opportunities that we're already asking for parents to be in like with us? So we would have to do, hey, before camp, they would have to come one Sunday night to talk through details of camp. Well, we would actually extend that time just a little bit and do a training for parents on whatever we needed to train them on, or give them some sort of opportunity to sit and talk with us. So like doubling those times that you have with parents already that you have to put in the schedule, to use those to hear from them, could also be good opportunities there. But start thinking of it in like smaller chunks of how you can get those relationships going, and knowing you don't have to maintain them all the time, but just having that connecting point that they've had conversations with you, and they know you and you know them, and you can get the story of their family.
Yeah, and also not thinking that, well, I'm the youth minister and I have to be the youth minister to every single student individually, but to continue to equip Sunday school teachers and parents, but also youth volunteers. I mean, I always think, gosh, building out your volunteer team. In fact, if I'm spending more time with them, the kids view this person, and yeah, oh man, maybe I wish they would come to me about this one thing, but actually it's like, well, they have such a deeper relationship with this other volunteer.
Yes.
That's not a bad thing. That's a great thing. In fact, especially if we're continuing to equip that person, and then we can, like, one thing we always have, I have 2 interns and we have some volunteers, and we meet once a week. And one major portion of our meeting is just student updates. It's just us talking about some of the conversations we've had, speaking into those things, and making us all aware so that we can continue to pray and know about these things. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of talking a little bit on the parent side, but kind of turning a little bit to some of the patterns and opportunities that we see from the youth minister side. Kendal, I know you work specifically in small groups, and we have a question here about small groups a little bit, but I wanted to ask you, what are some of the ways that small groups in particular can help meet this need that we see for community amongst teenagers, especially in contrast to the communities they feel like they have, as the question we have in the chat box says, that they might find communities online, Instagram, video games, etc. But then also what is it about small groups in person in the context of the church that actually makes them different?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, like this may not be, I don't know. I say this and I don't want this to come off like snide in any sort of way, but I just want to throw out there for anybody listening to, you're not competing with the other communities that they have. And I just want you to hear that, like that, take a weight off of youth ministry. Oftentimes we feel like we have to be the most engaging, most entertaining, most exciting place for our students to be, otherwise they won't come. That part is not on you. You do want to make a welcoming, hospitable environment for people to come, but you're not trying to compete with those other communities. So I just want to throw that out there. And that's not to say, I understand the question, so it's a really good question, but just to bring encouragement in that place. The second I would say is that, yeah, community groups is what we call them. So that's probably what I'll name it, just small groups in general. I think that they play such a significant role in this epidemic of loneliness, because they create the structures that we need for that relational discipleship or relational formation. They're different than, say, okay, a gathering on a Wednesday night or a gathering on a Sunday morning. Students could walk in and walk out, and they may not even be noticed if they were there or not, right? Because nothing is asked of them. But when you create a space where this is a community group, it's a smaller setting, you want to create spaces where basically, like, if a student's not there, it's going to be noticed that they're not there, right? Like if they're not present, it's going to be noticed that they're not present. As much as you can create those structures for us to know we have somebody, whether that's a community group leader, whether that's the youth minister themselves, a parent, whoever, that is looking out for this group of people. And when they're not there, they can do what Anna said and reach out because they know that they weren't there. Also, it requires something, the active versus passive kind of environments. If you have an active environment where a community group is a place where you don't just come and sit and receive, but you actually are asked questions, you're asked to participate, there's something expected of you, that puts a higher level of ownership into it. I think oftentimes with our students, we want to we don't, I would even say just with students in general, we want to try to lower the bar as much as we can so that a higher number of people will opt in, right? So we think if we just lessen what we're asking of students or parents or families, more will opt in. But really all that does is that actually like puts a lesser value on that space. If you think about the communities that your students are probably like really involved in, sports, academics, clubs, different things like that, there's a high ask of them, but that means that there's a higher ownership for them. And that's why they won't miss a practice, because if they miss a practice, there's something that's going to be that they're going to miss. Like there's something that's required of them that's going to be missed, and they're going to receive that. So I say community groups, like they serve that space of not only are we relationally connecting to one another, but it's going to be noticed if I'm not there. It's going to be expected of me to like use my voice and speak and participate and be there when I'm there. And it creates that space. I think one of the things that for youth ministers, myself included, community groups can be scary, because if we just do like the large group setting, then we're not having to deal with all the relational dynamics that come with a student saying, oh, I don't want to be in group with this student, or the student are fighting, so we have to work through that, or this thing happened in group. But I want to encourage you guys, like those relational dynamics that happen when you put smaller groups together are actually a gift, because they're opportunities to disciple your students in relationship, to not fix the problem for them, but to walk with them in, hey, when you get angry at a friend, how do we walk through that with this person? If this person said something that offended you, like, how do we walk through that with that person? It creates the opportunities and the structures to have that formation that we need. So yeah, those are kind of the bigger things I think community groups actually really serve us in.
Yeah. A couple things on that. I was thinking, so whenever I recently moved to a different church in Oxford, Mississippi, and the small groups, we go into the small group the first time, and I'm thinking, okay, well, we're going to ask questions about the Bible text. We're going to do all these things. And the students, these are high school guys, and they're like, oh no, we always start with highs and lows of the week. And I'm like, okay, well, yeah, we don't have to do that, and they're like, no, we want to do that. But then as we've done that practice, one, I was amazed that they would want to do that. But also, like, and some of the high school girls group, the middle school group, they've talked about how that time, and they always get to the Bible text and stuff after that. But actually sometimes that time ends up stretching out for the whole small group time, because someone starts to share. And like recently there was a girl, she's on the softball team, and she was running into some problems there where, because of a competition for a starting spot, it just led to some division on the team. And she was just really feeling this isolation and depression. And I could just see it on her face. But then while she was talking, there was a girl that was a couple grades younger than her, a few down, who I remember like a month before was also struggling because she's on the soccer team. And while she wasn't necessarily competing for a spot, but she felt so isolated because she was the only ninth grader who made varsity. And it put her in this weird spot where people are jealous and people are mad, people kind of making fun of her. And I actually was like, what, the athletes are the ones getting made fun of at this school? I was like, what the heck? I was like, but it was interesting because while the girl is talking about softball, the girl, she's just nodding her head, and I could just see in her face, I was like, clearly what she's thinking is, oh my gosh, thank you. Someone actually understands what I'm going through. Mm-hmm. Someone gets the tension and the awkwardness and the anxiety that I'm feeling right now that's isolating me from the other people. And so something so small like that is one of the ways we can continue to pursue and not give up on students without it really requiring, okay, I got to set this new event, or I got to set up this new meeting, but really just trying to move into all the natural spaces we have with our regular meetings, with our discipleship meetings, Sunday mornings. If you have our students, some of them have block schedules, and so they can like leave for lunch and they'll just come up to the church sometimes and eat lunch. But just using the times that we're already around them with a whole new vision and intentionality of, I need to draw them out in this moment. And thinking through, even before we move into those spaces, who are the students tonight that I might need to focus on? I need to go ask them how they're doing. I haven't checked in on this student in a while. Let me go check on this one thing and how they had mentioned those things. I think those are just some small ways. The small groups does that really powerfully.
Yeah.
Anna, anything you've seen and from your students or from your kids, but I was also, or even how the churches can bring in other generations and how intergenerational integration can also impact the of drawing out students from this place of loneliness.
Yeah, I love it what you guys have said about small groups, and it just makes me think how really honestly loneliness is met best by in really ordinary means.
Yeah.
Just conversation, just that I see you, I know what that feels like, or kind of what it doesn't involve big programs. It involves somehow just making a place for for people to just kind of be
Yeah.
together. We had the experience. I'm a widow, and so the church really rallied, particularly around my three sons, who were, 9, 12, and 13 when my husband passed away. And it was amazing to see them become friends with men and women in their 40s,
Yeah.
who were my age, or and a couple of the older gentlemen, spent time with them. And, when you're in intense grief, that's a really, really lonely time. So that was, back in 2011, my kids were really going through that, but they were met by the entire church. They were met by people of all age, people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, all of those people. Just, it can be simple, like asking how the baseball game went in the pews on Sunday, just giving them a fist bump. How'd you pitch last week? Super simple, but I see you kind of thing. And that just how to integrate generations. Well, we've got a lot of good articles on the blog about that. But I think it can start by opening your youth group to volunteers, of encouraging your empty nesters, encouraging even your elderly to volunteer with your youth. And, one of the people in the post that we did about loneliness wrote about how the older folks like to serve the youth by coming and checking them in when they're getting ready to go on a retreat. Just really simple, just being the familiar face. You don't have to have a big involved, go away on a retreat or anything. Just be a familiar face and encourage the adults in your church to be familiar faces to the youth in your church, and vice versa.
Yeah. Connor Coskery, he's another steering committee member, and I was talking with him not that long ago about intergenerational integration. And one of the things he was highlighting, and kind of what you said, is that by involving people from different stages of life, with different life experiences, with different struggles, temptations, sufferings, all these things, students build plausibility structures for when they enter into that place in their life. Okay, if I'm struggling with loneliness or singleness, I'm struggling with the fact that I don't have a boyfriend or girlfriend. Well, okay, there's this saint in our church who is 60 years old and she's never been married, or he's never been married, but yet he faithfully lives and continues to serve and take interest in the youth and in other families and serving the church in this way. But it creates a structure in their mind that says that is a way to live and be happy and find flourishing in the Lord. And there's so many other ways that they can do that. That's just so powerful. And I really feel like it's when we think of an epidemic of loneliness, probably the place we don't gravitate towards is, well, let me integrate all the, other people in the church. But actually it can be one of the most powerful ways that we can really do that, and also assist parents in coming alongside, because sometimes kids maybe don't want to talk about their parents about something, but they are more open to talking about someone who's older and wiser in that regard, because, maybe they think their parents are the dumbest people in the world or something. But then also, I mean, I had a student recently that she was telling, I asked her, I just said simply, just, how are you doing? And she said, not good. And I was like, okay. And she again shared with me, this anxiety that she's having, she's struggling to sleep, all of these things in this regard of how isolated she's feeling. And I was like, okay, well, have you talked to your parents? And she said, no. And I was like, okay, well, what's keeping you from sharing with them? She just said, that's just not what we do. That's just not how I interact with my parents. And so one of the other ways we can come alongside parents in that regard is also from the youth minister. If we're having conversations with students being open with us, not necessarily just going and reporting to the parent, hey, by the way, your kid's really struggling with this, which may be necessary. And actually sometimes you should do that. But there's also times where we can say with the student, okay, what are ways, what's it going to take? And how can I walk with you in making you be more honest with your parents? How can I walk with you in helping you to be more honest with whoever to ask for help, ask for counseling, whatever it may be. Liz Edrington, she in the parent article talked about just a simple question you can ask a student is just, is there anyone that you could imagine connecting with more? And then she said, and then the follow-up question is, what is one step you can take to make that happen? I just thought that was such a simple question. But gosh, if they could just say, well, honestly, I would really like to connect with my parent more, or these kids that come to youth group, or this friend more. What's one step? Okay, well, let's take that step. Maybe it's writing a letter. Yeah, maybe it's okay. I'm gonna go home and I'm gonna just talk to my dad this time, but then I'm gonna talk to my mom next time. But there's these little ways that we can do that. And then one other thing, Anna, you had mentioned, and it is also from the youth minister article we had ran on Rooted, that Eric had shared about, or not Eric, it was one of the other writers had mentioned that they heard a student basically say, gosh, do we always have to be so busy? And that was a student saying that, but it was really a challenge to them, because what he really was seeing is that sometimes all we need is space. We just need to give our students space and to allow them space to talk and just to hang out and just be kids, but within this space where we're also being intentional with them, and all of the ways that when we're not always so busy, we might see these start to open up more.
Yeah.
Any last comments you guys have on practical responses from churches or anything you guys have seen?
I would just say one other thing that I've been thinking through. So I read an article recently that was on Mere Orthodoxy, but they were talking about when we talk, so we've used the word twice now, plausibility structure, simply to say like that terminology, meaning creating something that somebody could look at and see an option for themselves within that area as well. And so, but he was talking about, okay, if one of the causes of loneliness, this epidemic of loneliness, not just among our students, but among our church at large, right, is technology feeding into a lot of this and how that's formed and shaped us. We can encourage our students, even what you were saying earlier, Skyler, of like being at church and not being on your phone, or being at youth group and putting your phone away. But yet we have kind of also at the same time tried to enter into our students' world to meet them where they're at. And we've actually created it to where there's not a plausibility structure for them to see how they could be off of social media or off of their phone. Our front door for our student ministries is often our social media platform. That's where we give out information. That's where we welcome people in. That's where we invite people in. We put QR codes up across our student ministry walls, say like, if you want more information, scan this QR code, like those kind of things. So we don't really create even plausibility of what it could look like to say, okay, we don't want you to be on your phone, but also be sure to check social media about information. Like we're creating this tension. So I think that's something that I'm thinking through at the church. It would be living kind of the way they put it in the article, is like living as exiles in this world, because everything is built around technology. But if that's something that we think could form our people in ways, and our students in ways that would fight against this loneliness epidemic, then what are, not completely removing ourselves from technology, but what are ways that we could create plausibility structures for our students to even see a possibility without, because I don't know if you've seen that, Skyler, in your parents, but I feel like over the last 6-ish years, I used to tell parents, hey, students can't bring their cell phones to camp. Like we're going to take them away. Like don't even bring them, because we'll just take them up. At first, that was not a big deal. Parents were like, oh yeah, sure, fine. We won't even send it with them. Now I'm getting way more pushback on that every single year. It gets worse and worse, of like parents thinking like, that's impossible. How could I possibly send my child to camp and not have a cell phone to connect to them? Mm-hmm. So even our parents are getting to the point of that doesn't seem possible or plausible. So yeah, that's something I was thinking through. How can we think in that term as well?
Yeah, that's, go ahead, Skyler.
No, I was going to say, we're running out of time here. So what I want to do is ask one last question for us. And then while we're answering this last question, if you guys could be sending any questions you want us to address in the Q&A, if you could just type those into the chat or the Q&A function, and we can maybe answer those briefly. But just the last question to close down before the Q&A, just want to ask if there's any places that you look in scripture and you see either a narrative or a story or any part of scripture that really you think this is one that really jumps out to me, that always has spoken to me in my times of loneliness, or I've shared it with a student and it's really been powerful and impactful for them in their moments of loneliness. But just wanted to close here by looking at how God speaks to us in scripture to loneliness.
I'm looking up my favorite one. I don't have it here. Here we go. This verse has really meant a lot to me. As I said, being in a period of intense grief, that is a very lonely time, and I think that's part of what's going on now with the pandemic, is that we're in a period of intense grief, and it is going to be somewhat isolating and lonely just to be grieving. We also grieve the loss different ways. So in a sense, we are going through, as a society, we're going through the process of grief, given everything that's happened, and honestly is still happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea that Jesus gave up his perfect fellowship as he was experiencing it, and came to earth as an embodied human being and experienced the things that we experience for me, so that I would not have to be lonely in eternity, in the hell of self by myself, but to rescue me, that he went into the deep loneliness of being separated from his Father in order that I would never have to be apart from him again. We have belonging. And I love Hebrews 13:5 in the Amplified. He says, and I have this all over my house in little Post-it notes: I will never, under any circumstances, desert you, nor give you up, nor leave you without support, nor will I in any degree leave you helpless, nor will I forsake or let you down or relax my hold on you. Assuredly not. Mic drop, Jesus. That is something I have to go back to all the time. But
that's awesome. Yeah, I would say just really quickly that the theme that I've tried to integrate into my ministry and bring more into conversations with students is just the theme of feasting. I think that throughout the scriptures, we talk about the idea and the command of fasting, but there's also a command all throughout the Old Testament of feasting, and it's tied into the end time of when we are with Christ, we'll be feasting at a table. We're invited into the wedding feast of the Lamb, right? So there's this beautiful tie that we're saved into a community, but that our eternity is in a community as well. And feasting around a table, I even see small groups as that table, right? God has prepared a table before us in the presence of our enemies. And that table includes other believers to strengthen us. And so actually taking time to feast together and actually taking time to sit physically at a table together. Families do it, it'll strengthen the loneliness. Churches do it, it will strengthen the loneliness, not just gathering in a place, but actually feasting. That's how God called us to remember in the Old Testament, right? He established feasts all throughout the Old Testament in a way to remember who God is. So I think that is a huge theme that pours into, we're never intended to do this alone and never intended to be in isolation.
Yeah, the Son of Man came eating and drinking. So he came to seek and to save the lost, but the method is that he would come eating and drinking, sitting at tables with sinners. That's why actually every time we meet for our youth group, we have dinner first, and it's some of the times we have some of the most impactful conversations. When I look at the biblical narrative, I find that it is remarkable how utterly gracious God is over and over again, especially to the outcast, the downtrodden, and the lonely. just right in the early chapters of Genesis, when Hagar has been cast out by Abraham, her son is dying, the Lord God comes and rescues his life, and she says that he's a God of seeing. It's a remarkable text. We see God sustaining them in the wilderness. We see David, so much of David through the first and second Samuel is him in the wilderness, not king yet, being chased. And then whenever he becomes king, his son rebels against him, and he's again in the wilderness, hiding in caves. And all along the way, David having to trust and rely on the Lord. And that's why I find the Psalms to be one of the most powerful means that we can sit down with students in loneliness and both weep with those who weep and empathize in the pain, but also look to the hope and that we have in our Lord God, who continually cares for us, who has sent his son to die on the cross for our sins. And then we see that even as the son comes and incarnates on earth, that his ministry is always going out to those who have been cast off from society through illness, through poverty, whatever it may be, through being just a foreigner. And yet those are the people he's drawn to. And that is true in our lives as well, that he is so utterly drawn to us in our weakness and in our isolation, because we are lonely and isolated. And that is not actually the moment when he is most repelled from us, but that is the moment he's most drawn into us. I think the biblical narrative is a powerful one to students dealing with loneliness. Yeah. And so as we transition here at the end, I just want to invite anyone in to, again, ask questions. You can either use the chat thing, the Q&A, or you can, use your microphone and speak. But also, if you guys have any places that you've seen in your ministry or in other ministries of ways that you've seen students be drawn out of themselves, drawn out of loneliness and into the fullness of belonging in the church, we'd love to hear from you and brainstorm together. And so if there's any questions, we'd love to hear them.
There is one in the chat. Can you see that, Skyler?
Okay.
From Brian?
Yeah. So we see here in the chat. Can you give us some thoughts, words to the idea of loneliness as it permeates the entire congregation? There's a sense of isolation within the youth, but there is a ripple effect across congregations where it has impacted who is available to volunteer, or adults who are willing to be present, or families that are even willing to come in person. Would love to hear how you might consider navigating this space if loneliness seems more structural and systemic, that loneliness and low morale can even affect us as a church staff and the desire to even want to do that. I think that's profound observation. It's certainly happening. I mean, if students are feeling it, students are probably feeling it even as somewhat as a trickle down from their parents and from the church. And so any thoughts that you guys have, Kendal and Anna, as you hear that question?
I think Kendall's idea of feasting.
Mm-hmm. So I was going to say, as one of the things, it seems really silly, but one of the things that my boss has actually been pushing really hard over the last few months is we're going to start doing potlucks again as a church, which to me comes to my mind. I'm like, man, that's what I did as a child. And we've kind of moved away because it seems uncool to do in some ways, but the opportunity to come together in person and not just come together to sit there and not just, there's a uniqueness in scriptures of what feasting is preparing the meal together and sitting around a table together, all putting your hands to one thing, to eating and into communing in that way. So I think in spaces where you can just feast together is a huge opportunity across the church at large. So for you I totally understand as church staff, I think we all feel this there's a level to which we have to guard ourselves in vulnerability and where we give our relationship because of the nature of our work and what we put our hands to. But where it could feel like, hey, inviting people into my home feels like work, at the same time, inviting leaders or church members to come and eat dinner with me is actually a way that serves my soul as well, to be with people, to sit with people. And so I think sometimes we put a lot of emphasis on, myself included, I'm speaking of this, but put a lot of emphasis on man, I just want to go home and veg out and not have to talk to anybody and not have to do anything. But there is a beauty to, even if it's just, hey, come to my house for an hour and a half and do dinner with me, that builds a community in deeper ways. And so I think wherever you can, bringing people together to not just sit and receive, but to be active, whether that be feasting or something else, I think is what will be one of the biggest ways to combat the isolation that we feel. And just being present, because there are people that are still going to be afraid to come back. And so you continuing to be present is a slow tread, but.
Yeah, I think in some ways, like Kendall, what you said is, I mean, in some ways, I think pastors, we have to be willing to challenge families and challenge people to say, hey, this is the commitment we make in church membership. This is the commitment we make to one another as being united in the same body. That's because just as we were talking about technology and everything, is that technology both exists because we're consumers, but then also makes us more consumeristic. Yeah. And so we can even treat churches as consumers, as saying, I'm here to receive the good teaching and the good music and to receive the good, Lord's Supper and maybe even a good potluck, but I'm leaving the second I can. But again, that's failing to see how much it really requires of us and calls of us that the call to love one another is a sacrificial call. And I think I have to tell myself all the time, and my wife and I, we say this all the time to one another. It's like, I don't really feel like doing this, but I know I'm going to enjoy it when I'm there, and I know it's going to be good for me. So, and also be willing to challenge.
Yeah, and I think that that's a huge thing, because just a sample. I was meeting with a family, a couple, an older couple recently, that they had very, very valid reasons as to why they were kind of holding back from being present in church during COVID. But so their circumstances have kind of shifted at this point now, and so but they haven't come back yet. They've kind of stayed away. They've had a lot of that fear, and just sitting with them and having a conversation and asking them those questions, like, helped to reshape, because we've been doing this for almost 2 years, like Skyler said. And so we've gotten into habits in a lot of ways that we may not even realize, like, oh, what was the reason before is actually not the reason now. So maybe I should be challenging my thinking. And that does take us having to have those hard conversations as brothers and sisters in Christ with one another. So I think having those hard conversations is necessary.
Our church has a really cool thing, and I think, Dustin, it's similar to can y'all see the Q&A? We can
Yes.
We can see it, but Dustin, I'll just share this with the group. This coming Saturday, Dustin says, we are having an intergenerational dinner titled Walk with the Wise, where we are bringing together the youth, 7th through 12th grade, and the 60-plus-year-olds in our church. This has been an off-the-charts desire and expectation from the older generation to be able to connect. That's just so awesome. It really does seem like the two most isolated groups in the church and beyond is the youth and the 60 plus. This is the first time we've done something like this, but helping create an opportunity to be a bridge for conversation relationship. That's just amazing. One thing that our church has started doing, and it hasn't really gotten off the ground super well yet because I'm in Alabama, so we can have like a really warm February day, and we can have a freezing, frigid, icy February day. But what we're doing is, like, I think Thursdays, we're just inviting the congregation to meet at a playground on I want to say it's like at 5:30 or 6 or something like that. And the ones that they've chosen have some open spaces, but they also have the playground equipment. But they're really reaching out and encouraging everybody and anybody to come. And so I think there's like a little brief time of prayer at first, and then everybody just plays. So there's like people throwing a football, and there's, little ones climbing on the jungle gym and that kind of thing. And it's just a chance for people just to hang out. It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't require anything except maybe reserving the park or whatever. But it's just a way to be together. It's outdoors, so it helps people who are having maybe a little trouble being indoors yet, or more concerned about distancing. It's just for fun. There's nothing magical about it. It's just for fun, and it's really cool, and it's getting people of all ages to come.
Both of those sound like great events. I just took a picture of the chat to write that down. walking with the wise.
Walk with the wise. That's good.
I will pray for us and we'll close down. Thank you all so much for joining us and for typing your questions. Possibly why we didn't have many questions at the end is because we were answering a lot of them as we were going and stuff. But thank you guys all so much for interacting with us. And we will continue to pray and continue to check out the blog and the podcast. And Rooted has so many more resources on this than even we've shared. Check out the 2 articles that were run this past week on the epidemic of loneliness. They will bless you and be of great help as they were to myself. And so I'm going to pray and then we'll close down. Father, we thank you that you have taught us that from you and to you and through you are all things, and to you be all glory, so that we might trust that even when we feel isolated and alone, that we know that your presence and your purpose is with us and working in and around and through us to move all things towards your glory and for our good. We pray that as we minister to our students, that you would give us words of wisdom, that you would give us the moments and the words of when to ask and when to press and when to encourage. And that ultimately that in each of our youth ministries and in churches all across the world, that we would begin to see students drawn out of the self, drawn out of their anxieties and out of their loneliness and into deeper relationships with one another. And that through those relationships, they would be drawn into deeper relationship with you. And that ultimately they will see that the Son of God has died on the cross for their sins, and in doing so has invited them into the loving fellowship of the triune God. And with that triune fellowship comes the fellowship of one another in the body of Christ. We ask these things in your name.